the accounting for transportation costs under merchandising business. For us to better understand this topic, we'll be basing our discussion on this article. Okay, so again, it is based on the law. Okay, so according to Article 1504 of the Civil Code of the Philippines, unless otherwise agreed, so take note that the goods remain at the seller's risk until the ownership therein is transferred to the buyer. Meaning, yung risk anchored, or the liability anchored with the product is still on the seller unless it's already transferred to the buyer, yung ownership. But when the ownership therein is already transferred to the buyer, okay, the goods are at the buyer's risk whether actual delivery has been made or not. Meaning, kapag yung ownership na kay buyer na, technically, the risk and liability anchored with the product is already transferred to him as well. So, be it na deliver man o hindi pa, siya na yung liable kasi the ownership is already transferred to him. So, this article is so important in understanding those terms na i-discuss natin later. Okay, so like for this one, in a buy and sell business, these are the following and common terms na define natin. So, we have the freight on board shipping point, freight on board destination. So, in letters A and B is just talking about sino ba yung liable while the product is in transit. Okay? Then for the letter C and letter D, it's just about who will actually pay the transportation cost, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually liable. Okay, para sa letter C and letter D, just talks about who actually remits the payment to the carrier. Okay, so let's go on with the definition. So with the term, so kung mapapansin nyo dun sa ano natin, 'di ba, we have this credit term. So mapapansin niyo dito merong FOB shipping point. So meaning, ito pa lang uh, terms na to, makikita natin siya sa purchasing invoice. Okay, so let's go on with the letter A and letter B. For the letter A, freight on board shipping point. Pag sinabing shipping point, ayan yung kung saan kinuha yung product. Okay, so most likely that is the warehouse of the seller. So, himayin natin, no? When you say FOB shipping point, it means that the ownership of the product is transferred to the buyer upon what? Upon shipment. Consequently, since nakay-buyer na yung ownership upon shipment, the buyer becomes responsible for the cost of transportation because he practically owns the merchandise while in transit. Meaning, kapag freight on board shipping point pala, si owner na yung liable doon sa product, since yung ownership is nasa kanya na, siya na rin yung magbabayad ng transportation cost to the common carrier. Ulitin ko lang kapag FOB shipping point, ang liability of the transportation cost is already transferred to the buyer. Okay? So, para mas maintindihan nyo ako, again, with this illustration. Diba? So, ito yung illustration natin with our previous discussion. So, take a look with the first picture dun sa FOB shipping point. Pag sinabi, nakikita nyo dyan yung delivery man, he is on between the seller and the car. Okay? Or the van. So, let's say ito yung warehouse. Kinuha or pinick up ni delivery man yung goods, okay, then ita-transit na, okay, i-deliver na. Once the goods were already picked up by the delivery man or the common carrier, the ownership already transferred to the buyer. Okay, so meaning, yung ownership ng buyer, nagsimula siya dito once na makuha na ni carrier yung product. Then, while in transit, sino nang liable? Si buyer na. Kasi from this point pa lang, siya na may-ari. So, kapag nasa transit na yan, habang dinideliver sa kanya, mawala man yan, magkaroon man ng damage, wala nang pakialam si seller. I mean, hindi naman sa walang pakialam, but si buyer na yung liable doon. So, pag nawala, hindi na liability ni seller, hindi na siya magbabayad doon. Hindi niya papalitan na yun. Kasi si buyer na yung technically may-ari nung product. ng product. Okay? So, just a summary, ownership of the goods passes to the buyer when the public carrier accepts the goods from the seller. Okay? So, let's go back naman. Nakuha ba when sa FOB shipping point? Tandaan nyo lang kapag FOB shipping point, dyan na magkakaroon tayo, since si buyer na yung owner ng product, let's say point of view ni buyer, magkakaroon na siya ng freight in. Okay, tandaan nyo kapag FOB shipping point, naka-anchor na account title dyan is freight in. Ang alam natin, ang freight in is part of the cost of inventory. Okay, so let's go on with the FOB destination. So when we say FOB destination, yung ownership of the product, mapupunta lang kay buyer once the goods were already transferred to the point of destination, meaning sa warehouse ni buyer. So, dyan pa lang mapapasa yung ownership ng product. So, himayin natin, under this FOB destination, it means that ownership of the product is transferred to buyer only upon reaching the specified place of destination. Consequently, the seller or owner still owns the product transported. Okay? So, which makes him responsible for the cost of transportation while the product are still in transit. So, kapag FOB destination, sabi dyan, mapupunta lang yung ownership kay buyer once nandito, nasa warehouse na niya. So, meaning, yung point ng destination, yung point of, shipping point up to while in transit, si seller pa yung may-ari ng product. Kung sino yung may-ari ng product, siya yung magbabayad ng diba? Nasa kanya yung risk at siya yung magbabayad ng transportation cost. So, meaning, kapag pala dito, hindi yung delivery charge, hindi yan part of our inventory kasi hindi naman tayo liable at hindi rin natin babayaran. Okay, so meaning, yung freight cost or yung delivery charge dyan, part of the expenses of our seller. Kaya nagkakaroon nga tayo dyan ng term na freight out. So meaning, ang FOB shipping point, freight in, ang FOB destination, freight out sa part of the seller. Okay? So, malinaw when we say FOB destination, ownership of the goods remains with the seller until the goods reach the buyer. Okay, so while in transit, si seller pa rin ang may-ari niyan. Okay? So, we're talking about the liability kung sino yung liable na magbayad. Sino yung dapat magbayad. So, yan, FOB shipping point and FOB destination. So, let's go on with letter C and letter D. Again, I said earlier that these terms under letter C, letter D talks about who actually paid the transportation cost. But it doesn't mean na sila yung liable na magbayad. So, tandaan nyo lang pag freight collect, the buyer shall make the actual payment of transportation cost to the common carrier. So, let's say dito freight collect, si common familiar kayo with the Lalamove, 'di ba? Sa paglalamove, 'di ba, magbabayad basta mamaya explain natin 'yan. So, let's say dito FOB shipping point, freight collect, si buyer yung liable dito. But yung pagbayad ng transportation cost, ibabayad niya yan once dumating yung carrier. Okay? Ibabayad niya sa carrier yung payment. But dito sa freight prepaid, sino yung actual na nagbayad? Si seller. Si seller yung nagbayad dun sa carrier while the goods is still in transit. Basta tandaan nyo, pag sinabing freight collect, the buyer shall make the actual payment, and freight prepaid, the seller made the actual payment. Okay? Pero, hindi sila yung technically liable. So, para mas maintindihan nyo yung freight collect and freight prepaid, nga, balik tayo dun sa example natin with Lalamove. Iba pag Lalamove, si seller, let's say si seller, may de-deliver sa yung goods. Ang mangyayari kapag Lalamove kasi, si seller muna yung nagbabayad. Let's say part ng ikaw yung FOB shipping point, meaning ikaw talaga yung liable na magbayad. So, let's say si seller, ang gagawin niya, siya muna yung magbabayad kay carrier ng transportation cost. Then, once dumating na kay seller, sa'yo, once dumating na sa'yo yung goods, ikaw naman yung magbabayad dun kay carrier. But, technically, si seller muna yung nagbayad ng transportation para sa'yo. Okay? So, in that case, possible may liability ka kay seller. Okay? not doon sa common carrier. Kasi binayaran na ni seller yung transportation cost para sa'yo na dapat ikaw magbayad eh. So, technically, may payable ka kay seller. Okay, so later on, mas maiintindihan niyo ako.